In this lecture, we're looking at Calvin and the organization of the church and the city in Geneva. And the purpose of this lecture is that too often Calvin is only understood in terms of his writing. He, of course, is the man who wrote the Institutes. He wrote commentaries on just about every book of the Bible, as well as a number of tracts and treatises during the course of the Reformation. But this lecture is to tell you that Calvin should equally be known as an organizer. In a manner of speaking, Calvin is one of the great organizers of the Reformation. And just about any reformer, of course, has an element in which he is both the lead theologian and pastor of the denomination or the movement that he is inspiring. But every reformer has some element of organizational principles that he is applying to either his city or to the country or to any of his followers. And Calvin is no exception. Calvin is a wonderful organizer, and we can appreciate that. But in actuality, the purpose of this lecture is to get an idea as to what Calvin believed was the best model of church and government that he had drawn from the scriptures, that he had articulated in his writings, but which we only really get a clear picture of when we see how he applied them to the city of Geneva. The other factor is there are a great number of misconceptions about Calvin's Geneva. A lot of these stem from the fact that people believe that Calvin is something like the Pope over the city, as if he has full range of influence and decision-making within the city, and therefore everything he wanted or believed, or, more importantly, everything that was done in the city of Geneva, was done so at his expressed command. But as we've seen again and again, Calvin is a man in his context. He's a man who is, in some ways, rising above and superseding the context of Geneva and attempting to achieve something new. But in other cases, he is held captive to those in power there in the city. And we can begin by noting that when Calvin agreed to come back to Geneva, one of the foundational platforms that he put forward was that the city would accept, at least in principle, his ordinances, as they were called, his ecclesiastical ordinances for the reformation of the city. Now, what is this document? Well, simply put, the 1541 ordinances are Calvin's model and his vision for the structuring of the church there in Geneva. And it's from this and then from the actual historical records as to what happened in the city that we can get a really clear picture of not just the general principles that are being applied, but actually some great detail as to what day-to-day life was like and what the church was doing during the years that Calvin was in charge there in the city. And the context is, as we've seen in the last 2 or 3 lectures, that Geneva is but half reformed. Calvin is at this point from 1541 on, as we saw in our last lecture, driving a hard line to reform the pastorate, to really get the clergy up to speed in terms of their biblical education. And while we said that that was the principal focus for Calvin, it was not his only focus. Calvin also believed that the city itself needed to be governed properly. Now, one caveat before we move into actually what Calvin taught and what the ordinances say, and then the actual unfolding of this in history. Too often what happens when we look at the city of Geneva, in particular when we get to the Servetus affair in a later lecture, but also now when we look at things like the consistory and the college of pastors and the seeming ironclad grip that the reformers had over the morals, the ethics, the day-to-day life of people, as well as their pretty rigorous examination at all times of the pastors. Too often what happens is we get tunnel vision. Part of this is because we have so much information about Geneva and its records, and so we can create quite a grotesque picture that seems to be abnormal, this desire for control over people. But we want to say right now, this is a 16th century issue. The 21st century person looking at this will very easily cringe at a number of the practices that are in play here. But you have to remember that these same practices were in play in just about every city. In fact, they're in play in every city that I've ever studied or looked at, and I've never seen much to the contrary in terms of the evidence from the 16th century. Just to give you one example, Henry VIII, when he began his Reformation, actually at one point early on, had circulated essentially a contract in which he wanted every male to sign off on the theological and ecclesiastical principles that Henry VIII had employed in his Reformation. This desire for control, in other words, is very much a 16th century way of life. And so the picture that I paint right now of the way Geneva functioned needs to be read in the light of all of these other complexities of just the way the early modern world worked. Pastors in cities believed that it was okay not only to pry into private lives, but also to correct them, to get involved in the kinds of things that we think are just our own private issues and we want no one to tell us what to do. This kind of American spirit, thumping the chest that no one will tell us what to do. This is not a 16th century virtue. And so when we look at these issues, we just need to keep them in perspective. And we'll look at this complexity more when we get to the lecture on Servetus, because the fact of the matter is that Servetus was pretty much the most wanted man in his generation. If Servetus had been captured and arrested in any other city just about in the wider European world, Catholic or Protestant, he almost certainly would have met the same fate that he met in the city of Geneva. But the history of it is that Geneva and Calvin are cited as some kind of, again, grotesque amalgam of authority, tyranny, and bloodthirstiness because they actually took the step of executing Servetus. And while we don't want to say that it's okay to execute anyone for heresy, then or now, the fact of the matter is that so many people were executed in a very bloody century. And so stacking up everything on this one city or this one man just simply is not the way to go. Okay, well, how was the city reformed and what did the ordinances propose to the city of Geneva? Well, the ordinances lay out a structure that is both unique and independent, that Calvin has more or less constructed based off of his reading of Scripture, but which also sat on top of the existing structure within the city of Geneva. And again, Geneva, just like every city in this day and age just about, is run by the magistrates. That is to say, the political rulers, the syndics, and those all at the higher bracket of power within the city always, always, always make sure that the pastors know that they are in charge. Well, there are two principles really that we see when we look at Calvin's organization of Geneva. The first is his concept of the church. Calvin's concept of the church is, like so many people, going all the way back to Augustine and even before, is that the church is a mixed group. It is the elect and non-elect, and Calvin is very clear on this, as every other reformer is. We do not know who is elect and who is not. That's usually a bit of a misconception about either Calvinism or some kind of vague antithesis or antagonism to predestinarian language. The idea in the church is never that one in this life, either as a pastor or anyone else, knows who is elect and who is not. It is assumed, in other words. And again, this is a historical principle that goes all the way back to the patristic age. It is assumed that there are hypocrites in the church who appear to be Christian, and there are those who are on the opposite end of the spectrum, those who appear to struggle from time to time, who are actually of sincere faith. It is not the job of anyone in this life, pastor or magistrate or anyone, to attempt to determine who is and who is not elect. Now, what's interesting about this principle is that historically there are two ways to really kind of divide this issue. There are some, and this is a bit of a caricature, but there are some who apply this idea of the mixed church in such a way that they really just kind of do a come one, come all, we're not going to make any distinction between those who are in and those who are out model of church government. Now, in the context of the church's history, that's actually quite rare. Most of those ideas come about in the Americas, and they come about as a result, in particular, after the Second Great Awakening. It's very common, in other words, for people in some circles, some denominations today, to say, look, the church is a mixed body. We don't know who's in and who's out, so we're not even going to try and provide much order or provide much discipline, let's say, onto the body. We're not going to try to excommunicate or censure anyone for doing things that we might find to be unbiblical. It's kind of a laissez-faire, open the doors and let anyone in model of church government. Well, where Calvin is coming from is where the vast majority of people historically come from, which is that because the church is mixed with both those who are elect and non-elect, the goal of the church and of the pastors and of those who are in charge of the political order is to keep very close watch and to provide good order so that the church doesn't simply fall off the rails. Now, again, to a modern person, this might appear to be contradictory. You're saying, Calvin, that the church is mixed, that there are elect and non-elect, But yet here you are talking about excommunicating those who are doing wrong. Aren't you somehow declaring that this person is elect or not elect? Well, that's just simply misunderstanding Calvin, and it's misunderstanding the history of this point. When Calvin and others are talking about things like excommunication or censure or control over those who are in the churches or in the cities, they see this as a more or less natural pastoral application based on the fact that they don't want to assume anyone is in or out. It's a sort of a catch-all that everyone has the capacity to sin, to fall into error, to do wrong, to do serious wrong even. As we'll see in a minute, Geneva is not a sanitized place. There's lots of risque things that happen, just like in the modern world. But don't mistake this idea of control or excommunication as coming from a place where Calvin believes or others believe in this day and age, that they are somehow determining who's in and who's out. That excommunication means de facto that you're now outside of the church. Calvin actually gives a clear comment on this in some of his writings. I'll give you just one. He says, quote, "It is not our task to erase from the number of the elect those who have been expelled, that is, excommunicated, or to despair as if they are lost." Meaning, what he's saying is excommunication is not declaring that someone is officially out of the church or in the church, period. That's not the role of it. Rather, the role of it is to say, hey, wake up. You think what you're doing is okay, or what you've done is not a big deal, or what you are teaching or believing is somehow just whatever you want to make up, and it might be out of step with biblical fidelity. Excommunication, in other words, is a way of censuring. Maybe an analogy is you don't disown your children when you put them in timeout to kind of wake them up to some of their actions or some of their attitudes. Calvin really believes that the discipline of the church functions this exact same way. The goal of the church, because it's mixed, is to provide order and structure so that those who are on the path of life will at least have some warning that they might consider their own hearts and their own faith in Christ. It's part of the pastor's responsibility, in other words, to correct and to censure things that might need to be squared with the Bible's teaching. So, that's the real kind of core conviction that Calvin is coming from, as well as a number of others. Now, the second feature of Calvin's idea of order and structure is that he does not believe that there is any rigorous, obvious structure or language sometimes in the scriptures, say from the book of Acts, that provides a one-to-one parallel to what they're doing in the 16th century. Now, this is true of all the reformers. None of them believe that when they're reforming the church, that what they're doing is reforming the structure of the government or of the day-to-day practices in the minute sense, based off of the book of Acts, let's say, or based off of the witness of the scriptures. That belief is actually something that is akin to the Anabaptist view. That what's happening in the Anabaptist faith is they believe that if it's not in the book of Acts, you don't do it. Well, theologically, Calvin, as well as Butzer and Bullinger and Luther and Cranmer, are all united on this front. They believe that there are good and necessary principles, perhaps drawn from the history of the church, so long as it's not corrupted, but also drawn from simply the context of where you live, where certain languages, certain structures are fine. They're perfectly okay. Calvin, for example, as we'll see in our next lecture, has no problem dealing with the Anglican Church with its pretty rigorous structure of bishops. He's also, as we've said repeatedly, wooing and pursuing those who are on the Lutheran side of things, and they have their own structure. Also, different cities in the Swiss Reformed world have slightly different structures with different management systems within them, which is what they believe is a faithful outflowing of their order and structure of the church. And I belabor this because Calvin does not have a necessarily singular view of church government. It's a myth, in other words, that Calvin is a Presbyterian at this point, or that he is congregational, or that he is pro-bishop. Calvin's belief in structure is that it's flexible to a degree. He is going to put forward what he believes is the best structure for his city, for his context. But there is not one place in Calvin's writings where if he's dealing with a Protestant church that has a different structure or order or government or whatever it might be, where he kind of sniffs and wags his finger at them and says, "Don't you know that my order is the only order that you must follow?" Calvin, in other words, is not a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or any of these groups that try to claim him as the forerunner or the originator of their form of government. So, for example, actually in the 1541 ordinances, Calvin actually retains the word bishop. Now, in his writings, it's very clear that he believes that elder and bishop are essentially the same office. He has, in other words, rejected the higher structures within the Catholic Church of bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and etc. But Calvin actually keeps the word. He also, by the way, refers to Butzer in a letter as the greatest example of a bishop that he's ever known. And it's very clear that he uses the word separately, that he is somehow a leading pastor to the pastors, which was really the early function of the bishop to begin with. So in the 1541 ecclesiastical ordinances, Calvin actually keeps the word bishop. It eventually gets taken away, and Calvin doesn't really care. Now, it's Calvin's successors, in particular Beza and John Knox, who will actually push more strongly an anti-episcopal or anti-bishop view into the bloodstream of Calvinism or Reformed theology. And there's reasons for them doing this, which we're not going to get into now. But in the context of the 1540s, Calvin is egalitarian, you might say, in terms of the church's role in its government. Two things, though, that he does add or that he affirms based on the context of Geneva as well as something that he wants to effect. The first is he institutes a parish-based system within the city of Geneva. The churches were arranged according to rural and urban centers, and each church had its minor geographical location within the city or within the surrounding environs. That is important to realize when we get to the company of pastors, as we're going to see in just a minute. The other reality, though, is that Calvin had to accept and just simply get used to the fact, as we've already said, that the magistrates are over the entirety of the city, including the church. Now, again, Calvin is often cited as a rebel, as somebody who believes in resistance theory, as it's called, that he believes that you can overthrow the government whenever possible, so long as you have biblical basis for doing so. That is as big a myth as there is in the entirety of the Reformation. Calvin wants to distinguish the orders of the church and the state and give them essentially sovereignty or jurisdiction, you might say, over various spheres. But there is nothing in Calvin that smacks of the modern belief that we want the political world more or less out of our churches. Well, the reality of Geneva is Calvin had to deal with the fact that the magistrates were unwilling to give certain sovereignty or jurisdiction to the pastors in certain areas. The magistrates actually, in the ordinances, make sure that there is included very strong language that the magistrates and the magistrates alone have authority and jurisdiction over things like excommunication, the calling of pastors, and the censuring of pastors. Now, Calvin's main beef with this is not the politics of it. His main issue is that he doesn't like theologically untrained and biblically less literate people determining the scope and the direction of the church. He sees in this, in other words, not a fundamental issue of, quote, politics and religion, but rather the issue of untrained men who might have ulterior motives as to why they back one pastor versus the other. Calvin, frankly, being a good lawyer, realizes that when it comes to theology and the judgments of Scripture, you need to call on the experts. Don't let the civil magistrates run the show. But in this case, Calvin does not prevail. To the day that he dies and long after, the syndics and the magistrates of the city of Geneva rule it with a very tight grip. Well, beneath the magistrates and the political order itself, Calvin provides and names two structures that are really unique for the city of Geneva, and they are the company of pastors and the consistory. Well, the company of pastors is the easiest and the probably most famous thing that Calvin introduced. Because the city is a parish model and because the pastors are essentially over their neighborhoods or their small regions within the city or from without the city in the rural areas, Calvin believed that it was necessary for all the pastors to meet on a regular basis. Now, Calvin actually does not have a three-part or a two-part system of church government. Calvin actually has a unique system of what he believes are the offices of the church, and they are fourfold. Calvin believes that, first of all, there's pastors, which is typical, very obvious. He also believes that there are deacons. Their main responsibility is the care for the poor. And he believes that there are elders, who are laymen that are selected from the church, who are there principally to supervise the morals and the life of the church day in and day out. Now, in Calvin's model and in the context of Geneva, these elders are actually usually the less influential, less wealthy folks from the city and from the churches. Those who had money and power and prestige were already part of the magistrate system. They were already part of either the syndics or some other slightly lower rank of civil government within the city. It would make very little sense, in other words, for someone to be, say, a syndic and an elder within the city or within the church. He already had authority in other areas, and so doubling that authority by making him also a local elder in a church made no sense at all. Rather, the elders in this case were usually men of upstanding, wise counsel who were chosen to help shepherd the church in terms of the oversight of the morals and the, say, Christian life of the families in their parish. Well, it's the pastors that meet weekly, and this is the company of pastors. There is one person who is considered to be the moderator for the company of pastors. This is a position that Calvin himself held more or less until his death. And the moderator wasn't the bishop, you might say. He wasn't gaveling people down and kind of governing everything in this sort of iron-fisted way. But he could exert enormous influence, and Calvin does. And the company of pastors met every Friday morning. They had worship, and then they had meetings, usually about private business, that then led to something called the congregation, or the congregation. Let's go ahead and anglicize it. And at the congregation, one of the pastors would be selected each week to deliver a sermon. And after the sermon, there would be response, usually from the moderator or from the pastors, sometimes in critique, sometimes in praise, sometimes in clarification. This company of pastors, in other words, is one of the best examples I've found in church history of the model that iron sharpens iron, and we need one another's criticism and praise, highs and lows, as we walk through our understanding of the scriptures. The idea here is not that the pastor who delivers the sermon is under the gun, and that it's the job of the pastor to determine if they're going to kick him out afterwards if it was a good sermon or not. Rather, the idea here is that he would deliver a sermon, he would expound upon scripture, but it wouldn't simply just hang in the air. If some of the other pastors had questions or concerns or clarifications, they would raise those issues there in the congregation. And I think this does speak to Calvin's more humanist side. He believes that preaching is a matter of rhetoric. And anyone who's taught or preached over the years will tell you, sometimes you say something that you think is crystal clear, but the way it's heard, or the way the words come out, or the tone or the inflection, something causes some confusion in those who are listening. Maybe you didn't say enough. Maybe you said too much, whatever it might be. And so the company of pastors is there to edify and nourish the biblical reflection in the sermons of all the pastors in the city. The next group is the consistory, and this is the one that gets all the attention, frankly, from historians and from people looking at the social history in particular of the Reformation. It's hard to understand how the consistory fits into any kind of modern concept, and the fact of the matter is it probably doesn't. And it is the uniqueness of the consistory that brings out so much of the problems that we sometimes overread Calvin or Geneva as this tyranny, or perhaps that we just simply don't understand it. Again, we have a wealth of information because we actually have some gaps here and there, but we have a number of the consistory records as to what they were meeting and discussing all throughout the years, not only of Calvin's life, but beyond. Well, the consistory, in just a simple way of putting it, is the legislative body, the city court that ruled over issues not only of big sins and big problems with laxity within the church and within the congregations, but even small ones. And the consistory had the 4 syndics who were sitting in it, as well as a mixture of those from the other bodies within the political regimes of Geneva. And typically, Calvin or some other pastor, some lead pastor usually, would either sit in for counsel and guidance or would sometimes be in there just about every time it met. The consistory, notice, is the main organ for providing excommunication or some type of discipline on those who are doing wrong. And again, this speaks to the complexity of Geneva. Here you have a political body that only consults with the church at best sometimes, deciding the discipline of those within the congregations. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes it is pretty severe and quite kooky in terms of the 16th century application of justice. Those who want to find obvious examples of the history of misogyny can easily go to the consistory records at times and find examples where angry tyrant fathers are merely reprimanded and not thrown in jail or something worse. You can also find examples of women being called into the consistory and chided for not attending service diligently enough. And I'm not going to simply just sit here and recount all the more strange examples of the cases that were held and were aired out in the consistory. Doing so would be somewhat analogous to going online and looking up crazy laws associated with different states in America. In other words, simply focusing on the things that are abnormal or that seem so different from the modern world actually would give us a cartoonish image of what the consistory is doing. There are clear examples, again, of this being a 16th century age in terms of its control. But by and large, the focus of the consistory was to encourage people, whenever possible, to the reconsideration of their faith and to a recommitment, you might say, to the biblical pattern of life. In some cases, this is quite good. A drunken father, unlike other times in certain parts of the history of the world, is not allowed to simply be a drunken father. He is hauled before the consistory, and at times, pretty severe discipline is applied to get him to stop doing this. Frankly, just as a historian, for all of the crazy examples of weird justice being applied here in the consistory that we could trot out here in this lecture, I could probably trot out just as many that show a real sensitivity to real life issues, things like drunkenness, anger, fighting, abuse of children at times. And frankly, these are issues that in the later modern world are not addressed until, frankly, the 20th century. I mean, it's a long time in human history before someone can really be hauled up for child abuse and drunkenness, these kinds of things. But there are examples of this in the consistory records. And I think just as much as we can shake our head and eye roll some of the 16th century ways of life and the attempt to control everyone down to the lay level, well, we can also applaud some of the ways that they stepped in when they needed to. Well, the way all of this desire for control and church development within Calvin's ordinances and just simply the way that Geneva developed over the years can really be played out in the way week to week, Sunday to Sunday, the average layperson would have experienced church. Because you have two real foci. On the one hand, you have Calvin and others admitting that it's not their job to kick out everyone who seems to be a sinner. After all, this is the Reformation. If there's anything that's axiomatic for all the reformers, it's the ubiquity of the original sin that stays in all of us even after justification. They're not really shocked by sin. But there is this other focus that's driving towards control. So what would that look like? Well, if you and I were to wake up in an alternate universe, suddenly we found ourselves in Calvin's Geneva, our week would go like this. We, as layfolk, would be required on Sunday and Wednesday to attend church service. These were usually in the mornings. This is, by the way, an age before the 8 to 5 or the 9 to 5 workday. If the city wanted you in church on Wednesday morning, you're going to be there. Service in Calvin's Geneva was meant to last only an hour. Calvin, it seems, and others, but Calvin in particular, doesn't want long, lengthy, deep, hour and a half, 2-hour services. Rather, he wants frequent, you might say bite-sized, short moments where one comes to worship or to hear the word preached. And to that end, as we saw in our last lecture, Calvin actually preached just about every day of the week. And the other worship services were optional. You could come any other day, but Sunday and Wednesday, it was required. In the church, men and women sat separately. Now, this is somewhat normal for this day and age. But here's the thing. Everyone sees in this, again, some sort of misogyny. It's actually the opposite, at least in terms of their impulse. You see, because when they separated men and women in the service, what they did often in these churches was they built a 2-tiered system within the main sort of floor there in the sanctuary. And they put women and children down front, and they put the men behind them. Now, there are all kinds of myths about this, usually coming about by some myths about Puritanism or something like this. The idea is that, well, we put the women and children down front because they're the most volatile and the least likely to listen to the sermon. So this is seen as some kind of way of keeping control of them. Well, that's a 21st century belief. Here's the thing. If you grow up in a world without microphones and amplification, what are the best seats in the house? Not the back. The best seats in the house are from the middle forward. In a manner of speaking, what is happening in this system with the separation of men from the women and children is the men take the worst seats and they give the best seats to the women and to the children so that they might hear the word preached. They would be able to hear the preacher better, particularly if the person was soft of voice. So in a strange way, it's a bit more like chivalry than it is about chauvinism. The idea is allow the women and children as the real core of the family unit. And they believe this. Moms and children are the glue of the family unit. Put them forward and let them hear the word preached, and the men will take the worst seats in terms of being able to hear or in terms of visibility of the pastor. Other things that were applied just in terms of the service, if you and I were there in Geneva in church, we would not be singing hymns, we would rather be singing psalms. Calvin took this from, in particular, the Strasbourg model of worship from Butzer. And what he did is he cared so much about the music because he wanted the word of God on their lips and being sung. Calvin is not, in other words, throwing out all the instruments and all the other kinds of music in and of itself, not in the modern worship war sense, but rather he has a group of people who have no songs on their heart, who have spent their lives watching the liturgy being performed by priests. And so what the singing of the Psalms brings is both an edifying and a nourishing and an aesthetic quality to the service that Calvin believes is required. And in the end, if we were there in Calvin's Geneva, we would have communion 4 times a year. In other words, Calvin has thoroughly lost the battle to have weekly communion or even monthly communion. The model in Geneva that is employed is quarterly communion service. Well, in the end, Geneva is a mixture of control as well as a desire to provide pathways and avenues for average men and women to explore their faith and to learn the scriptures. And while it might seem unique and sometimes quite strange to the modern world, this was the model that Calvin employed in Geneva in an effort to serve, not himself, but those in the city of Geneva. Okay, that's it. Next, we're going to take a look at Calvin's influence and his connections to England and to Scotland.